Hello, my friends. You may already know that you can add alternative text to CSS generated content, but what you may not know is that browser support is actually pretty good. Still, I wouldn't recommend that you use it, at least not for all kinds of use cases. And in this video, I explain why. Let's say we have a button. Inside this button, there's a span element. And in CSS, I'm selecting the span element and I'm using a pseudo element, the before pseudo element, and the content property to add text content, or in this case, a Unicode character. What we get is this nice looking star, and that's all fine and great. The problem with that is that if you use a screen reader, it will read something like white star button. Let me show you. I'm in Safari now and I'm using voice over the built-in screen reader here. And this is what we get if we find the button.
Voice heading level 1, white star, button. All text for CSS generated content number 1, voiceover off.
So you can see how it says white star button, and that's not what we want. We want something like add to favorites or something like that. We could use aria label here and say, you know what, we're going to override whatever is coming from the contents of the button and use add to favorites like that. That works, that's fine. But you can also use CSS for that. So in your content property, you add a slash after whatever is the content of the property, like the Unicode character here, or it could also be an image that you reference using the URL function. And then after the slash, you have your alternative text for that icon or image. And if we look now into Safari,
Add to favorites, button. You are current, voiceover off.
that's what we get. We get add to favorites. So not the icon anymore, but the alternative text for that. And that's great. Or maybe not so great, because the problem that I see here, or one of the problems, is that we don't have a proper separation of concerns. I'm a big fan of separation of concerns. In HTML, you have your markup and your content. In CSS, you have your styling. And in JavaScript, you have your JavaScript. We shouldn't mix those. One of the biggest problems is that it's very unexpected that content for an HTML element, for a button, is inside your CSS. That's not the first place I would look for content. What we can do, instead of adding the content in CSS, we could do the following. We could use the attribute function and say, you know what, we want a reference to the data alt attribute, which I just made up. And we put data alt on the element. And now CSS takes the content from the attribute. I added too many quotes here. Sorry. And that should work as well. If we test that, let's go back to Safari.
Add to favorites, button. Voiceover off.
It still works, and that's great. There's just one problem that I have with that, and it's an issue with translation. Because most, or probably all, let's say most translation tools don't translate custom attributes. So if we take our demonstration here, our demo here, and I use Google Translate, and I translate the content to German, you can see how the heading changes from my demo to meine Demo, so the German translation. But if we look at the accessible name of the button, we'll see that it still adds to favorites. So it doesn't translate whatever is in the attributes. That's true for custom attributes, but if you use aria label, for example, it works. I've just added a second button here. I'm translating the page again. And in the second button, I'm using aria label. And you can see how it now says zu Favoriten hinzufügen, which is a German translation of add to favorites. So that's a problem. Translation tools don't translate custom attributes. Another problem we have is what happens if CSS doesn't load. So if for some reason your CSS doesn't load, it doesn't happen often, but it may happen. I can simulate that. So if I remove all the styles, you can see what happens. There is no content anymore for the button. That wouldn't be the case if we were using an image, for example, because the image would still be there in the HTML. But if we don't have any CSS, we don't have an icon, we don't have an alternative for an icon, we have nothing, and then we just says button, which is not great. Okay, so there are many reasons not to use these elements, this feature for the content property, but there are still possible use cases which I find okay. Let's say, for example, we have a button like this. So we have an icon and text. That's actually my favorite. If we use actual text and then maybe add an extra icon to make it look nicer or more, make it more understandable or discoverable, whatever. But the combination is great. This specific solution here isn't great because if you remember, I told you that for this star icon, it will read white star. So what we get as the accessible name of this button here is white star adds to favorites button, which we don't want. So we don't want this icon in our accessible name for the button. We don't want it in the accessibility tree. And one way of removing it is to add our slash and pass an empty string in the content property. That's basically like using an empty alt attribute on an image. And now it will only say adds to favorites and just ignore the image. And that's a good use case. That makes sense. That to use it like that. That what works for me. The only problem that I have with this is that, like I said, browser support is great. Most browsers support it, but there is a combination of screen reader and browser that does not support it, and that's NVDA with Chrome. I did a test very recently, and yeah, NVDA with Chrome just ignores the alternative text for an attribute. And that's an issue because according to the latest screen reader survey, NVDA with Chrome is the second most favorite combination of screen readers and browsers. So a lot of people would miss this alternative. And yeah, that leaves me with my final recommendation: don't use it. It's not reliable enough, and it doesn't make as much sense as you may have thought. Now the question is, what can you do instead? So let's say we have our combination of icon and button. What you can do here in order to make sure that the button doesn't contribute, sorry, that the icon doesn't contribute to the accessible name, you just add aria hidden and set it to true. That removes the icon from the accessibility tree, and all we have is add to favorites as the accessible name. That's perfect. If you have a situation where you only have an icon, which usually isn't great, but okay, it happens, you still use aria hidden, but then you can wrap your content, the text content, in a span, for example, and use a visually hidden class which hides the content visually, but still make sure that the content provides the accessible name for the button. That's something you can do. You can also use aria labeled by or aria label, but if you ask me, my favorite way of labeling an element is to just provide text. If you can't do that, provide text but hide it, and then go for aria labeled by or aria label. This is actually also the preferred priority of methods for labeling of Adrian Roselli, who explains why in this specific order in this blog post. Yes, and that's it for alternative text for CSS generated content. There is much more to learn because there are some bugs in Safari. Adrian Roselli wrote about it. I linked an article. I linked his article in the description, and there's also an article to Stefan Juris' blog where he introduces the 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 method for providing alternative text for content for the content attribute, and he also gives more context. Yes, that's it. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, then please leave a like or subscribe and share it. And if you want to, you can suggest topics for the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon.